I'm Kenyon McDuffie. I am council member for Ward 5 in Washington, D.C., and I also serve as the council's chair pro temp, as well as the chair of the Committee on Business and Economic Development. And I've been on the council since 2012, and fortunately, I've been a Washingtonian my entire life. Today, I have the privilege of moderating this conversation on the importance of ensuring social equity in the emerging cannabis industry. It is an industry that hasn't quite emerged in the district yet because of Congress, but we hope that it will be emerging in terms of recreational cannabis, that is, as soon as the rider is removed and we can pass legislation that has been introduced at the council, both by the mayor as well as by Chairman Mendelson, myself, and Charles Allen. This topic is taking on newfound urgency, given those introductions by both the mayor and the council of the legislation to legalize cannabis and expand operating licenses. I worked on this bill with my colleagues for more than a year to ensure social equity was prioritized in any scheme to tax and regulate cannabis. Notably, our bill, I think, goes further than the mayor's bill by setting aside more equity-focused resources to redress the past harms of the war on drugs, expunging cannabis possession records instead of simply sealing them, setting aside dedicated funding to cover startup costs for cannabis entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds, and prioritizing operating licenses for longtime minority Washingtonians. An important part of this conversation is demonstrating why we cannot afford to think small on social equity in the cannabis industry. We have the unique opportunity in the nation's capital to empower diverse entrepreneurs and equip them with the resources they need to thrive. This is an issue of racial equity, social justice, and economic inclusion, all things that I've really been passionate about and championing in the District of Columbia over the last several years. I hope today's conversation will be informative for everyone watching, both on Zoom and Facebook Live, and demonstrate why legalized cannabis without attention to these important concerns would be a serious policy failure on the part of the district government. I'm going to continue to use my platform to demand an equitable cannabis industry and bring attention to this issue as we move forward. With that said, I now have the pleasure of introducing our brilliant panelists. First, we got Courtney Davis, who's the Director of Public Affairs and Government Relations for Marijuana Matters. In this capacity, Courtney leads the community and government outreach efforts to advance equitable cannabis policies and regulations to eliminate barriers to economic opportunities in the regulated cannabis markets for communities of color. Prior to joining Marijuana Matters, Courtney served as legislative assistant to Colorado Senator Michael Bennet. Courtney's a Ward 8 resident, and we are thrilled she could join us today. Next, we have Queen Adesuyi. She's a policy manager at the Drug Policy Alliance's National Affairs Office in Washington, D.C., where she works to advance the Alliance's legislative priorities on the federal level, including marijuana legalization with a racial justice focus, drug decriminalization, and eliminating collateral consequences for drug use and previous convictions. She also advocates for equity, racial justice, and plans for the District of Columbia's emerging marijuana industry, in addition to advancing overdose prevention measures and harm reduction. She helped convene and co-leads the Marijuana Justice Coalition. And under her leadership, the coalition worked on the introduction of the historic passage of the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement, or the MORE Act, by the U.S. House of Representatives in the 116th Congress. Then finally, we've got Doni Crawford, who is a policy analyst at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that looks to address DC's racial and economic inequities through the budget process. At DCFPI, she's authored First in Line, Why the District Must Take a Reparative Approach to Recreational Cannabis Policy for Black and Brown Communities, which is a must read for anyone who has an interest in this. Prior to joining DCFPI, Doni worked at Neighborhood Allies, where she co-led the implementation of All in Pittsburgh, a collaborative regional strategy to achieve equitable development in the region's economic transportation. Now I'm going to turn it over to the panelists to give some introductory remarks before we start our discussion. I'm going to start off with Courtney, and then we're going to move to Queen and then Doni. And I'll give you all just a few minutes, 2 to 3 minutes to make your introductory remarks. Courtney?
Thank you so much, Councilmember McDuffie, for the invitation to speak today. My name is Courtney Davis. As you mentioned, I serve as the Director of Government Relations and Public Affairs for Marijuana Matters, a DC-based nonprofit that's focused on standardizing social equity in the cannabis industry the way that it's understood. Our mission is to leverage the potential economic opportunity that the industry presents by advocating for what we would consider to be equitable policies that reduce barriers to entry into the market from anything from retail licenses holders to packaging manufacturer and the many ancillary opportunities that the industry presents. In order to achieve true equity within this industry, we believe there must be cooperation amongst 3 core groups: community members, public institutions, and cannabis businesses working in one accord to truly create what we would consider a social equity cannabis ecosystem. Our organization has created a social equity toolkit that's available on our website, marijuanamatters.org. If you have an opportunity, please check that out. It provides a great guiding principles that these 3 groups can use as they strive to achieve a truly equitable, inclusive cannabis industry that can be used in many states, including DC, and that can really help us to address what we think is the major challenges facing the industry, is repairing the harm from the failed war on drugs policies. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak. Looking forward to the conversation at hand. Excellent. Queen.
And thank you again, Councilmember McDuffie, for the invitation and for your fire behind this issue. My name is Queen Adesuyi, and I'm a policy manager with the Drug Policy Alliance in our National Affairs Office. And as was mentioned, I work primarily on the federal level to advance marijuana justice reform, largely behind our effort behind the MORE Act, which successfully passed the House last Congress. But I also am really excited to be able to work locally in DC, really helping to explore the question of what does equity look like in the district. And I sit in the middle between advocating on the federal level and trying to lift the rider after years of advocacy, and feeling really confident and really optimistic, cautiously optimistic about our chances this Congress to lift the rider and to finally be able to see legalization actualized here. But it's been a great opportunity to be able to work with council members and community members and other advocates to really explore, the will to find social equity in the industry space here. One thing that I always like to flag for folks and remind people is that DC really led the effort to censor racial justice when it comes to legalization. Before DC's campaign to legalize marijuana, we saw campaigns that really didn't focus or have a root in the realities of racial disparities. I believe Washingtonians really moved to legalize cannabis because of the horrors of enforcement and the acknowledgement of the harms of racial disparities, the fact that Black communities and Black people throughout the district really bore the brunt of criminalization. So I think, DC in a lot of ways has inspired the national conversation, which now really is rooted in racial justice, as evidenced by the U.S. House, a whole chamber of Congress, voting to legalize marijuana and end prohibition through this lens that has a focus on expungement, resentencing, providing funds to communities that are directly impacted by criminalization. All of that speaks to the principles behind the campaign that really led legalization efforts here in DC. So I'm looking forward to, again, working on the federal level to make sure that DC is able to actually have the conversations around equity in council and in community, and to, again, inspire other jurisdictions throughout the country in terms of putting forth legislation that really speaks to the principles of economic justice and social justice, and what it might look like to make sure that this new legal marketplace is one that's reflective of the people who really bore the brunt of criminalization.
Thank you for that, Queen. Turning next to Doni.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Councilmember McDuffie and your team for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. My name is Doni Crawford. I'm a policy analyst at DC Fiscal Policy Institute, and my organization is a think tank. So we spend a lot of time putting out research and analysis around how DC could be more equitable with its public policies, with its practices, as well as budgeting. And when I saw the mayor's bill in 2019, I knew that I wanted to do something around cannabis, and Queen was really helpful to me, as well as Khadijah at Marijuana Matters, where Courtney works, just in helping me learn this landscape. And I made a personal commitment to myself when I joined my organization that I didn't want to put out research that just talked about racial disparities and racial inequality. I wanted to make sure that that was grounded in history, historical context, root causes. And so as part of my report that the council member mentioned, I just want to name that a partner made sure to say to me when I was first drafting it to talk about the Eastern origins of cannabis. Cannabis has been around for civilizations, and it started in Asian cultures, and it was used to make a variety of things from hemp fiber to paper to canvas to sails on ships. And it was also used as part of religious practices and as an anesthetic. And I just want to name, it wasn't until in the United States in the early 1900s when usage became very prevalent in Mexican and Black communities. That's when we saw policymakers and the press start to criminalize those people in those communities. And for decades, as Queen said, there's been many prohibitive policies, primarily due to that history. And then, of course, in the 60s and 70s, when usage was more prevalent among white people, that's when we saw states start to decriminalize cannabis. And so that's really important for this conversation, just to know where we're coming from and what has happened over time so that we can fix it. And for me, I really think about cannabis policies around how to be reparative in three ways. I think about addressing current and historic harm, and I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit later, but I've been following what's going on in the Biden administration around people being let go or not being hired when they were honest about the fact that they used cannabis in the past. So that's something we have to make sure here in DC that we're also looking at. Obviously designing an industry that is racially inclusive, and we'll be talking more about that today. And then again, I work for a Fiscal Policy Institute, so definitely interested in seeing where we're putting the cannabis sales tax revenue and making sure that we'll be able to address harms to Black and Brown community through that new pot of money. So looking forward to the conversation.
I appreciate it, each one of you, for those introductory remarks. And I think you just touched on Doni a bit. We're going to jump right into in a moment. Just by way of context, I'll try to direct questions specifically to one of you, but there'll be obviously, I think, an opportunity for either of you to jump in if you have something you want to add to one of the questions that I asked. And so let me just start it off for all of you, though. What does social equity in the cannabis industry actually look like? I think a lot of folks hear that phrase more and more these days, particularly the word equity. But when you hear that phrase, what does it mean to you, and what do people think about with respect to social equity in the cannabis industry specifically? And I'll start with Queen.
I think for me, you know, the word has been coined and used in ways that I don't necessarily agree with oftentimes, especially by big corporations who, you know, think maybe giving a little discount or something is like qualifying for social equity. But I do think that social equity is a broad and comprehensive kind of goal when it comes to ending prohibition, while also acknowledging that we have to grapple with the harms of capitalism. You know, capitalism is what is at the end of legalization in a lot of the places that we've been successful in legalizing. But we are not always prepared for the ways that capitalism still maintains a lot of the systemic issues that prohibition did. So for me, social equity is not just about the industry side. It's also about making sure that the people who have been criminalized for marijuana are receiving relief, so they're able to lead stable lives. We often see people who are impacted by arrest and incarceration having to deal with lifelong consequences that are beyond a person's interest in owning a dispensary. So we want to make sure that social equity provisions and broader marijuana reform is comprehensive and as comprehensive as the harm that prohibition was on people. So we want to make sure that people are no longer barred from employment opportunities because of marijuana use or a previous conviction. We want to make sure that people are not barred from housing, nutrition assistance. We want to rectify and think about the ways to account for the fact that people have been deported for this plant. People have lost their children because of this plant. And again, not everyone who's impacted by prohibition wants to own a dispensary. So it's really holding both of those pieces, making sure that the industry and the marketplace that's born of legalization is, again, reflective of communities and people are able to access it. And we're not creating kind of a prohibition 2.0 where this legalized market will leave people behind and we're now dealing with criminalization in a different way, while also making sure that we're responsible with this new revenue stream and making sure that people are benefiting from it regardless of their interest in joining the industry.
Doni, Courtney, anybody want anything to add? What does social equity in the cannabis industry look like to you all?
I would agree with everything that Queen mentioned. I think that it starts with engaging stakeholders. And I like to stress also a lot about community education, education for members that are part of public institutions and as well as private industry, because although cannabis is not new to the world, it is a new industry that a lot of folks that has been primarily and historically just, about freeing the plant. And so I would say that the conversation about restorative justice and economic opportunity, community reinvestment, these are not newer concepts to those of us on the stage, but for individuals in positions of power, sometimes they need a little bit of more of a better understanding of that. And it's important to have folks like us at the table to introduce some of these concepts and understanding that this is also something that may look good on paper, but the actual implementation of these laws has to continue to be monitored. We need to make sure that there's data collection for the policies that we're introducing in X benchmark years after they're passed into law, so that we can make sure that we're actually eliminating collateral consequences as a result of drug records such as access to housing, that we're actually helping individuals from the reentry community if they want to participate in this industry. And so I think that there's a lot that can be done in the data collection and oversight and implementation of these policies as we think about what looks good on paper and what we really want to pass.
And picking up on that point, Courtney, what looks good on paper, making sure that we're thoughtful about, folks in the return to citizens community. I'm going to turn to Doni. If and when the district passes a bill that legalizes recreational cannabis, what happens if we are not intentional about social equity when we do that? If we pass a bill that isn't really thoughtful about some of the things that Courtney and Queen talked about and making sure that it is inclusive, particularly given some of the missteps that we've seen in other jurisdictions.
Yeah, if we're not inclusive from the very beginning, we're only going to see these racial disparities exacerbate. And I think a perfect example of that, even though it's not cannabis, is the vaccine approach here in DC and how we weren't intentional from the beginning. And we saw that a lot of Black people did not get access to vaccines. And so that's something that has to be baked in from the very beginning of our policies. And I totally agree with Queen and Courtney, returning citizens, Black people, brown people have to be a part of this. And there's ways that we can do this through policy. For example, I know you're going to talk more about the council bill, but currently about half of the licenses are going to go to social equity applicants, which is a great thing. That didn't happen immediately in a lot of states. So it's good to see that we're learning. The data component that Courtney talked about, that's baked in from the beginning. So if there's any missteps that do happen, hopefully there won't be any, but if there's any that do happen, we'll be able to look at the data and correct immediately. And I also want to flag just making sure that it's not just well-connected people that can access the industry, but making sure that people at all income levels, if they want to be owners, returning citizens, they want to be owners, that they have the opportunity to do so.
That's an important point. Capital, obviously, and I don't want to take anything that you all might say in response to my next question, but it's a big challenge facing folks who want to enter the industry. Courtney, talk a little bit about other challenges facing current entrepreneurs, particularly those from historically disadvantaged communities in the cannabis space, and how can the city, government, private industry, and others work to address the challenges?
Yeah, access to capital is a pretty big one. And that's really for a lot of folks that are interested in the cannabis industry, but in particular for communities of color. There's been a historic issue with having access to capital loans, low interest loans, grants, and things of that sort. And so I think that, as I believe Doni mentioned, having money pre-tax sales that's available for aspiring entrepreneurship, I think, is imperative for social equity, for equitable and inclusive industry. I would encourage grants and forgivable loans over low interest loans or loans that have to be paid back. I think that there's, just a lack of capital that folks have access to. And so sometimes, and the barriers to entry into the cannabis industry are so high, ultimately over $1 million for a lot of these licenses or ways that people want to participate. So I think that having someone borrow $1 million and still have to have real estate priorities or commitments, and all of the other regulatory burdens that the industry has, I think it would be nice to have an opportunity for folks to really have this money as a grant as opposed to a loan. I think that there are some conversations about how state chartered banks and state level credit unions can be a part of this conversation, and how can we support some of those Black owned banks that we have in DC to educate them, let them understand what the risks are, and protect them from those as they look to lend to individuals that are looking to get into this industry. And there's also, technical assistance. I think that when I talked earlier about things that look good on paper, we're talking about preferential and priority licenses, but are we truly setting people up to get the license? Do you know what it takes to apply for a dispensary license? It's essentially a retail store. Have you had any experience writing a business plan? I think we have to meet folks where they are in all aspects of this. Creating a pipeline program for re-entry individuals. I think that it's nice to have these policies in place, but are we truly setting folks up for success and giving them the tools that they need, which is technical assistance, money? Let's be frank, people need money to get these things started.
You definitely need capital to get things started in this industry. We've seen in other jurisdictions where, despite their best intentions on drafting legislation, the real reality is that they lack the resources to really enter the market. By they, I mean minorities and others who have been really impacted by previous laws that have really been destructive in our communities. And speaking of that, Queen, if you read, and I know many of you all have already read Doni's excellent report, she mentions that Black Washingtonians make up 89% of the district's cannabis-related arrests. how do our current laws concerning drug use, possession, and really sort of some of our older laws around the war on drugs affect other issues like employment, access to capital, entrepreneurship, loans, housing? What are some of the other collateral consequences of the laws that we've had? How does it impact some of the population that we have currently in the District of Columbia?
Yeah, so I would love to point people to a recently released report that the Drug Policy Alliance put out called Uprooting the Drug War. It's a report that really flushes out the ways that the drug war is so expansive. It's beyond just drugs. And I think that's a critical piece to really keep in mind, that, you know, our drug policies are rooted and focused on drugs when we're not necessarily focused on public health. We're not focused on access to housing. We're not focused on access to social services that help, again, stabilize the lives of vulnerable folks, people who are living in vulnerable conditions. But I think outside of all the ways that the drug war affects different pieces of people's lives, I think one piece that I think is really worsened by the current global pandemic is around overdose. Our drug war policies, again, focusing on jailing people because of drug possession, fail to actually meet people where they are and in fact just exacerbate the harms of drug use. We've seen countries like Portugal and even states like Oregon move to decriminalize drug use and drug possession with much success. We see in Portugal serious decreases in overdose, decreases in spread of HIV and Hep C, and an increase in folks who are getting into treatment, especially willingly. Our current focus on punitive measures and punitive approaches and stigma don't serve people who use drugs. And until we, you know, center the fact that our goal has to be on saving lives, we're going to continue to make mistakes and push policies that only harm the most vulnerable amongst us. And I think the sentiments around marijuana reform really need to be extended to other substances as well. Because I know marijuana as a substance is a lot more palatable and a lot easier to reach people on. But I think really to get at the end of the war on drugs, we need to really think more expansively and looking towards removing criminal penalties for drug use and drug possession, period. Because it's the best public health approach to addressing drug use, and drug use, which is actually a public health issue. It should not be handled as a criminal legal system issue. So I'm looking forward to the ways that marijuana reform really is building out kind of the foundation for a real shift in our country. And I'm looking forward to the ways that our country will really grapple with the fact that we really need to stop putting people in jail just because they ingest drugs. And separately, I think it's a failure in funds. I think the overwhelming amount of money that is spent on enforcement really should be diverted to other services, whether it's harm reduction, other social services. We're wasting a lot of money and ruining a lot of people's lives, over stigma and over policies that are not rooted in evidence and science and compassion.
I appreciate that. And one of the things that most people who follow the cannabis industry will recognize is the revenue that jurisdictions generate from the industry. Mm-hmm. Doni, you talked about it a little bit earlier in your intro, but I want you to spend a little bit of time talking about the types of things you think the city should prioritize, again, if and when we have a program in place here in our city.
Yeah, so within the DC bill right now, 30% of the cannabis sales tax revenue, and let me back up and say the estimate around annual cannabis sales tax revenue here in DC is somewhere around $20 million right now. And so 30% of that is slated to go to the grants and loans that Courtney talked about, technical assistance for social equity applicants, which is a great thing. I'm also hopeful that we can spend some of the sales tax revenue directly on assistance for Black and Brown people to build wealth. And that can look like a number of different things. Of course, a lot of people are focused on Evanston, Illinois right now, and whether or not that's reparations. I see that's the conversation on Twitter these days, but whether or not that's reparations, they are providing down payment assistance for Black people who have been harmed in the past with cannabis. So I really like that. And,
Uh,
oh, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead. I was going to say something
Okay.
about reparations, but I'll do that later. Go ahead.
Okay. I was going to say you're also interested in guaranteed income programs, and that's something that we can also use that money for as well. For me, I just want to make sure that it's as targeted as possible. I know oftentimes this is something I've been thinking about. We have to use proxies for race because the completely shut down anytime we try and mention race to correct for past policy failures. So making sure we're designing that part right, like what does social equity look like in the bill? That's something I'll be focused on too.
Yeah, you just said a bunch of things I think are important right there. I want to ask you a couple of sort of follow-ups on that. You mentioned the courts, and I was having a conversation, and I'm going to blank on who I was talking with, but I was talking about the impact of the courts on I was talking about COVID vaccination policy and vaccine equity, and the fact that a lot of jurisdictions, including the district, are using proxies like zip codes and other geographic policy approaches, disadvantage this or what have you in terms of the nomenclature because they can't use race. And how the courts play such an important role. And I'll take an opportunity the last day of Women's History Month to note we have a all women's panel, and I'm really kind of taking a step back and letting you all do your thing because you're the experts. But also just watching some of the conversations about the Biden administration's nominees to the federal bench. One in particular here, who's on the district court for the District of Columbia, nominated for the circuit court in DC, Ketanji Jackson. And so I just want to take a minute to plug that because I think that is so incredibly important. And also to plug that I funded a disparity study in last year's budget, and hopefully it'll be awarded soon and we can get to work so that we can move toward, or I should say back, to having a minority business enterprise program to really address some of the concerns you all have been raising about past historical harms and frankly, present day harms that still stem from structural racism that exists in our city. So, but 30%, is it enough, Doni?
It's not enough. It's not enough. It'd be great for that to be higher. I'd love because as everyone's mentioned, we want to make sure people have access to these licenses and have access to capital. So it'd be great for that to be maybe 50%. And then the other 50% go to community wealth building opportunities. Interested in other people's thoughts.
Well, anybody else have a thought on what percentage should be directed?
Yeah, I'm definitely down for that fund, the percentage to increase. But I definitely would also throw in there that I do think the community reinvestment fund can easily also just be increased. I think the priority would and should be the community reinvestment fund, just because of the point that I mentioned earlier that, not everyone who's impacted by marijuana arrest want to be a dispensary owner or want to be in the industry. And I think it's critical that revenue is funneled back into communities more broadly to address broader issues. But either way, I really do support the funds and the intention behind it.
Right, and funnel back into those communities with their input so that we are, supporting there are a lot of nonprofits in DC and organizations that are doing great work that could use, some funding that's given to some of the larger organizations that always get everything.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be nice, and again, stakeholder engagement and having those conversations on the front end. And I think there was a mention of an advisory council, making sure that those folks are included in the decisions that are being made about the money. That's
an incredibly important point. I want to just take a quick opportunity to encourage attendees to submit any questions that you all have so we can try to get to those in the second half of this conversation, and folks on Facebook Live as well, if you all would do the same. I had a follow-up that I wanted to ask. I also want to give a shout out quickly to Yvette Alexander, my former colleague on the council, who is one of the attendees on the Zoom. It's good to see you, Yvette. Courtney, from your role at Marijuana Matters, I want to look at, well, I was going to ask about sort of how we address the capital, access to capital issue, but I also want to address, Yvette makes me think about, and this is no reflection on you, Councilmember, but there are communities of color, right? We talk about social equity, we talk about past harms, we talk about the war on drugs, we talk about mass incarceration, but there are still communities of color in many ways, people who think that we shouldn't do this, or that this would create more harms than any benefit that might accrue from establishing a recreational marijuana program. How do you all respond to that? And what kinds of things would you encourage people to think about who think that this is just a bad idea and that the city shouldn't do it?
Yeah, that's definitely, addressing the stigma is a big part of Marijuana Matters platform with our education platform, because I think, as Queen mentioned earlier, a lot of these beliefs and ideas are not rooted in science. It's, a lot of fear mongering. I grew up as a part of the DARE generation, and they just lumped all the drugs in together. So I think that we have, there are a number of ways that you can approach this, from a medical standpoint. I think it's important to have buy-in from individuals in the medical community that can substantiate some of these claims. I think that when I worked on the Hill, we gave a lot of money for research and development, and that came from the federal government. That is not happening for the cannabis industry. We need those dollars to be able to research and create, white papers based on research that can show and prove what some of the benefits are of the cannabis, of the plant. I think that, we need boots on the ground. Folks have to host sessions like this with community members. We at Marijuana Matters, we think there's a role for the faith community in these conversations as well. They've been a pillar for civil rights movement. We see this as a civil rights issue. And so I do think that, it starts within your community, talking to folks, having the proper talking points, to be able to, efficiently have these conversations. And also, I think that in some of these legalization bills, there should be money for public health safety to make sure that children understand. I think Colorado and some other states, there's money there where they do to research are there more minor use of this plant. Make sure that children understand that this is not something that's, for them. It's something that's for individuals over the age of 21. So I think that you can have it both ways. And again, if you do not decide to engage in this industry, that does not mean that there are companies, particularly that are owned by white men and women that are making billions of dollars off of something that you still think is a gateway drug.
All right. Doni or Queen, anybody want to add to that?
Yeah, if I can just add, I think there are several ways to bring people in to this space who are skeptical for very valid reasons. Like, we live in a society that has really socialized us around the harms of drugs and really nothing else. But I would start with the fact that, regulation, there are real serious public health arguments for why regulation actually is safer for both people who consume cannabis, and then also for concerns like youth access and quality control and things of that sort. So, in a regulated market, you have to show ID to be able to purchase cannabis. And for young people who, qualify for medical purposes, like, they would be able to go through the medical process to access cannabis. But I think, making clear that criminalization and the status quo, even in the gray market, doesn't really give us the public health benefits that regulation really would, in terms of being able to track all of these different pieces. Criminalization really, again, worsens every piece of this. There's no tax, there's no revenue to be for communities to benefit from. There's no, again, public health approach when it comes to quality of products that are in the market space. And with regulation, we're able to do that. So, and then separately, I think the medical benefits are something that are often really appealing to people when they actually get to learn the science and evidence behind the medical benefits of cannabis. It's really our policies that are getting in the way of even more medical opportunities to really alleviate issues that are treated by pharmaceutical products that often have higher risk profiles than cannabis. So I think it's a matter of just doing education and meeting people where they are and where their interests are. For folks who are in the veteran community, understanding how our current policies really impact veterans and their access to medicine that for a lot of veterans is preferable than other medicines that are on the market. So again, it's just, I think, re-socializing and doing that education amongst community members and highlighting the ways how the status quo is really failing us.
What about just one last thing before we turn to some of the questions from folks who are watching, and we touched on it a bit earlier. You all have with respect to returning citizens and making sure that the program is inclusive. Has anybody seen where some jurisdictions have gotten it right? What specifically can we do? Does a bill that we've introduced do a good job of that? Is there more that we should be doing in terms of legislation with either the recreational drafts that are before the council or the medical marijuana program?
I'm not sure there's a jurisdiction that can actually claim like true success when it comes to at least even just what's understood as social equity broadly. I think we're in a situation where we're flying a plane while building it. And we're still trying to figure out what actually is the best ways of implementing the principles that we're, leading with around social equity and racial justice. I think, Chairman Mendelson and Councilmember McDuffie's bill takes several amazing steps towards these principles. And I think with proper implementation can do great benefit to the community. But I think, there are struggles with all of the equity programs across the country. But I think it's a matter of being intentional in policies that really makes a difference rather than passing bills that are not intentional around racial justice and then trying to fix it after. That becomes difficult for folks. And also putting, the money where it needs to be. I think, again, not funding policies sets people up for failure. And there are a lot of people of color in industries across the country that, often feel failed by policies that were well-intentioned. So it's just a matter of making sure that we're on top of implementation and continuing to improve the bill as it moves through council, as we're learning things continually. This is an ever-evolving industry. Again, we've never been here before. We've never been in the place where we're actually talking about what regulation should look like as of the last several years. So.
And I would just add that I really like that in this bill, two things. Obviously, expungement automatic. There were some jurisdictions where the onus was on the person who was arrested or convicted of past crimes that actually have to initiate that themselves. So I like that piece. And there was also this piece on child welfare. And when I was doing research, I saw that if you legally use cannabis, some people were at risk for losing their kids for that. And there's actually provisions in this bill that will prevent that. So those are two things that jumped out at me that I really like.
Okay.
And on that piece, especially for parents that are giving birth and often faced with non-consensual drug tests and having to deal with child welfare issues there, like the bill also addresses that, which I think is important. And also addressing people who are on probation. So, I think addressing people who are impacted by the legal system is one of the centerpieces that has to happen in a bill that, claims to care about racial justice. Mm-hmm. But figuring out the industry piece is an ever-evolving conversation. And I see in the chat about the ways that both bills actually still include some additional penalties. I think that is true, that those bills include additional penalties that should be reconsidered. I think we should look at what happened in New York as of yesterday, really, the passage of New York's bill, which made attempts not to include additional criminal penalties, and looking at other ways of getting to enforcement and compliance without adding new criminal penalties to the books around cannabis is going to be critical. And I hope you can have that conversation as the bill moves.
Sure. A couple of shout outs. Shout out to Eric Spencer, who's testified before my committee. He's been an advocate for participation of returning citizens in our cannabis programs. Also to the 100 Black women, the Metro DC chapter. We got some folks who are on and are watching, including, again, my dear friend Yvette Alexander and others. I think Timmy Bennett might be on as well. So, John, I'm going to turn to you and see if we got some questions from folks who are watching.
Absolutely. We have a few questions, Councilmember. The first question comes from former Councilmember Yvette Alexander to Doni, and just wanted to ask about the revenue estimate for the current DC cannabis sales. And just wanted to clarify, did you say it was at 20 million? And that's coming from the medical cannabis community.
Right. I was referencing the estimates for what recreational sales of cannabis would bring in, and that was the chairman had mentioned 20 million. There's not a FIS out yet, but old estimates of potential sales here from ITEP actually said it could be as high as 50. So I'm interested in seeing what the fiscal impact statement will look like. I don't know how much medical is bringing in each year. I don't know whether any of my fellow panelists do.
All right.
I'll look it up because I'm interested.
Okay. We have another question, and this is for you, Courtney. How can DC agencies be proactive in providing capital, and what agencies should play a role in this endeavor?
I think that there definitely has to be a collaborative effort when the agencies, when the question about which agencies are going to control this. I think that ABRA has done a great job with, as we can see from taking over the medical program. I mean, the applications is increasing, all of that. And so I think that when there are a number of different agencies, like there's issues with zoning that the Attorney General's office can address. I think that there has to be directives for agencies to work together collaboratively, because as Queen mentioned when we started, this is a comprehensive, social equity is comprehensive, and it crosses over a number of different issue areas, jurisdictions. I mean, there's reinvestment, there's the restorative justice portion. And so I truly think that it cannot lie with just one agency. And I don't know exactly, which 5 or which 6 I would say should be involved, but I do think that as we get more and more creative, like one of the things that I like that Oakland is doing is they have a shared kitchen that's funded by the city of Oakland, run by a nonprofit. They earmarked $2 million. And so you have, an opportunity to find individuals that maybe wouldn't be able to pay for their own kitchen space. You're finding real estate for them. You're offering them smaller kitchen spaces. There's also a workforce development aspect where they're paying individuals to be trained on compliance and management and product manufacturing operations. And so you have a workforce development piece there. And so all of these agencies need to talk to each other as they're appropriating these funds. And so I think when we talk about social equity, we have to think outside of the box. We've got to think bigger than priority licenses that just one regulatory body can grant. We have to really spread this money around, meet people where they are, and that's going to include a comprehensive approach from DC government.
Anybody else want to add to that question? I mean, that response?
Just quick before you go to the next question, John. Courtney just mentioned Oakland and the work that they're doing there, and I want to give a quick shout out to former Councilmember Adesuyi Brooks, who was really instrumental. We had conversations with her when we've been doing our work over the past probably 2 years, specifically around the social equity component of recreational marijuana. And so quick shout out to former Councilmember Brooks. John?
Yeah. So there's another question that came in the chat. And it has, do you have any thoughts about how legislation can adapt to further enable equity after our initial opportunities provide data on the effectiveness of primary legislative enactments? And this is for everyone.
One of the things I was thinking about was how Massachusetts, when they saw that their licenses weren't equitable, they started devoting all their delivery licenses to social equity applicants. So that's like an example of how you can adapt once the industry starts. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I will just have to say that like DC Council shouldn't think of, you know, passing one bill as like checking the box and, you know, we did marijuana. It's definitely going to be, it's going to have to be a concerted effort that is revisited over the years to be on top of the impact of the policies that we put forth. You know, it's not necessarily going to be perfect, but I think the intention and moving in good faith is going to be critical to making sure that we are as close to that as possible. And I feel like there is a lot of political will at the table, but it's a matter of making sure that we actually are being tangible about the principles that we say that we support. You know, folks in the community want this largely, and I think we stand to benefit with the opportunities when it comes to cannabis. So it's a matter of DC Council, DC Executive, staying on top of this marijuana issue over the years, even after, you know, the first passage of a regulation bill.
And those principles can be built into the text of the bill to make sure that it's not restrictive and that the benchmarks are there and opportunities for review, you know, social impact research studies every couple of years. I think that there's a number of ways that you can continue to monitor and track, again, through data to make sure that we're hitting the benchmarks that, you know, when we talk about writing these legislations, there's an intent behind it. What are we actually trying to achieve here versus what it says in the text?
And that actually reminds me, the council member mentioned Eric Spencer. I was talking to him and he had mentioned that Detroit has an ordinance that they're considering where so they said half of the licenses go to social equity applicants and the rest go to the general population of who wants a license. And if they don't reach 50% for the social equity applicants, there's an actual like provision in the bill that makes the industry, the issuing of licenses pause until they reach that 50% threshold. So that's pretty.
I believe that's also in the council's bill too, which I think is really impressive and going to be critical to making sure that we're on top of it, like in real time also, like any license that's changed, like making sure that the ratio is still there. That's an example of a way of trying to write in the principles into legislation. And one thing I just would want to encourage, even moving forward as the bill moves and continues to improve, is encouraging members of the council and the executive to be bold. I think there's a lot of will and desire to see DC kind of lead on progressive regulation and progressive approaches to marijuana. So I'm hoping that we can actually actualize that here. We should be bolder than New York and continue to inspire folks across the country that are moving to legalize. Again, like DC started off with the first campaigns to even really message on the importance of racial justice. So I think as we're actually, you know, implementing regulation here, it should match that same energy.
Agreed.
We had a question come in from Facebook that asks, are you all's organizations hosting education and experience events to break the stigma and deal with the anticipated generational backlash or internal conviction of using cannabis? For example, like anxiety.
Wow, generational backlash. That was strong. We have a number of events that our organization puts together, and I think earlier I mentioned, you know, buy-in from folks from the medical community, and so we do. You know, I'm a policy person. I am not a medical cannabis expert, and so in our events that we have, we make sure that we bring on doctors and nurses that can talk about a number of the public health issues that could come, you know, cutting edge research. I think there's been something floating around about cannabis use leading to some kind of stomach issues. And so, you know, I don't know if, you know, all of these things are accurate or true, but we do have as an organization that, you know, one of our pillars is education. We do provide folks with education that's happening, whether it's good or bad, and wanting to make sure that we're staying on top of the things that are happening within the industry as it continues to move. I'm not sure about, you know, anxiety specifically, but I think that that's something good to flag if folks are thinking about what the long-term impact might be of legalization for adult use.
Yeah, I think that again just speaks to stigma and needing to really work through that. I think that's going to be, the medical community is going to be critical in that. Also patients. I mean, people with real life experience with the plant. I'm a patient myself, and I know in real life what the plant is able to do and how it increases the quality of life that I have and other people who benefit from cannabis. So I think it's just, you know, getting out of the mystical place that we're in, thinking that the plant itself is just, you know, boogie person or boogie product that is so scary. I think once we demystify it and again articulate how the status quo is far more harmful than a regulated market, which would actually contain use by, you know, having a accessible market which has regulations and rules. And again, we can make sure that it's a product that isn't as easily accessible to young people who shouldn't be accessing it outside of medical issues. And we can actually make sure that products are safe. And I'm not necessarily for, and I'm actually really interested in ways to limit big marijuana, you know, like on the federal level, as I also work with folks on the federal level, that's one of the biggest questions right now is how do we address federal regulations and how do we make sure that the industry is not just taken over by really big corporations and big tobacco and big alcohol. And I'm very sensitive to the concerns that people have about big marijuana. But I don't want to conflate that, you know, which is really more of a kind of capitalist concern and how capitalism often is counter to public health. You know, when the idea is to make a lot of money, the focus isn't going to be on health and access and, you know, a lot of our principles. So I'm very open to the conversation about ways to limit big corporations in lieu of public health and education and access. But I think it's just a matter of doing the work in community to educate people about just the nuances of policy.
And if I could quickly add, John, for the next question, that was actually a blind spot for me because I was thinking about, I was doing research and I was seeing how the location of dispensaries and cultivation centers is very connected to the sentiment around not in my backyard, especially in places where this is happening in like Washington State and Colorado. And I was thinking about that here and like the over concentration potentially in Ward 5 of both facilities. And we were on Clubhouse, Courtney and I saw Rafi join. She's in here too. She sits on that ABRA board. And I wasn't thinking about the fact that if, let's say there's legislation that says we can only have X amount of dispensaries and cultivation centers in Ward 5, that makes it more difficult for a person to get a facility because land is more expensive in other wards. So that's an area where it would be really easy for a big corporation to come in, buy more expensive land to be able to profit, but that's harder for like someone like us to do. So
that's a great point, Doni. And you know, as a council member who represents the ward with more of these facilities in other wards, we've also got to recognize, and I think it speaks to what you talked about earlier in my question around the stigma, how we have these conversations in community so they understand not simply the stigma or the problems that they might see as associated with these types of facilities, but the benefits that are derived both from their health perspective as well as economically when you talk about recreational. And so I appreciate you raising that because, you know, I'm going to probably need to turn to you all when the conversation comes back up about how many we have versus how many they have in Ward 3. The reality is twofold. You mentioned it. It's much more expensive to get a warehouse if they have very many warehouses in Ward 3. It's much more expensive to get one in Ward 3 than it will be in Ward 5. And what we know, because one of the first things we did that was priority for me when I took office was working with then Mayor Gray to do the Industrial Land Transformation Task Force to assess the impact of the industrial land in Ward 5 and how we can sort of transform some of it. And so we got to look at the reality and understand what it means to put that cap in versus having some flexibility around that so that we can look at what it means to all those patients who need cannabis, who live in and around Ward 5 and what that means to them if we have these types of caps on it, particularly since we've had the cap for so long. And that dates to be before my time as a council member. And so thank you for raising that. But I know that as we look at the medical cannabis industry, in fact, I'm going to be filing an emergency soon to address some aspects of our current medical marijuana program, given that we have a couple of licenses left, as well as looking at testing facilities, which we have none currently in DC, and we should have testing facilities in within our borders here in the nation's capital. So again, I appreciate you raising that, Doni, and any opportunity that you all have to continue to amplify that aspect and what it means versus this notion that there's an overconcentration in one or two wards is going to be helpful to me and the people who live and support lifting some of these caps. John, any more questions?
Absolutely. So we have a question from Facebook and one in the Q&A chat that coincide. One person asks, is there any preferences being provided in the council's bill for federal drug offenders, but specifically returning citizens? And then is there any work being done to get the word out to the returning citizen community that's been previously harmed by by marijuana policy and laws to address that now with the new industry coming on board?
The short answer is yes. And again, I gave a shout out earlier to Eric Spencer because of his advocacy that he's had in this space. And frankly, I think many people will recognize the harm that Black and brown communities have experienced because of the war on drugs and some of the antiquated laws that we've had. And so it absolutely, the emergency that I'm doing too. So yes, it has it in the draft bills. I think the mayor's bill has it, the council bill has it, but also the emergency that I'm filing this week is removing the prohibition on some of the felony convictions, and it allows folks who have certain felonies to be able to run and operate medical cannabis facilities as well.
If I can just add, I think it's going to be really important that as the bill moves in council and as folks prepare for eventual public hearings, that it is spread far and wide. You know, it's a public hearing that I think Washingtonians have been waiting for years. You know, since Initiative 71 passed, there hasn't been the ability to do a public hearing. So now that we're actually able to do it, I think it's going to be really important that everyone in the community knows, so people who are directly impacted by these policies are able to actually share their voice before council. So I think, you know, as the bill moves, that's going to be important for council members to reach out to constituents and for advocates as well to spread the word of the advancement of the bill in council.
That's a great point, Queen. And go ahead.
I was just going to mention one other point on the last question, because I really think it was really important that you acknowledge the nuance of, you know, having to balance fears of, you know, not in my backyard, but also access for patients. I just want to make clear, though, that the efforts around legalization is one that people come to that table regardless of their own consumption of cannabis. You don't have to be a cannabis user to find this issue important because it really impacts people regardless of your cannabis use. But, you know, legalization efforts are not meant to just push cannabis use on people. So for people who stand to benefit from cannabis as a product, people who live with chronic pain, people who live with PTSD, people who live with conditions that really impact their quality of life, and stand to benefit from the medicine, it's important that we're making sure there's equity across the district and dispensaries are not concentrated in predominantly white areas, while also acknowledging people's fears of and stigma really around vices, being over concentrated in Black and Brown communities. It's a very nuanced situation, but I'm really appreciative that you're able to see that. And I hope that we can work through that nuance.
Absolutely.
So we had another question come in, and Timmy Bennett says, thank you, Councilmember McDuffie, for having this important conversation. When jurisdictions legalize cannabis, new enterprises such as transportation for both plants and money, storage, etc., are born. How can the city ensure that equity is prioritized in these offshoot industries?
That's a great question, Timmy. I don't know if any of the panelists want to take that.
Yeah, I think that there are, again, there are opportunities to build these priority licenses into the bill before it's passed. I think that what we saw in states in the West, that there have been a number of, they just, legalized, and then all of a sudden they're creating these new industries like delivery and non-retail storefronts, and are now in the back end trying to figure out how to get folks involved in this industry. And so I think that by creating thresholds for social equity applicants, micro licenses are also something that our organization supports and that we should think about, which I know is a plant touching opportunity, but I don't know if anyone on the panel has seen a application for a dispensary license, but it also includes, I mean, it's a lot, but states are also looking for applications that include their transportation and their security plans. And so if you have a business, you could be the ADT of cannabis. I think that there are that there could be thresholds for those opportunities as well. It's not just all about cultivation, dispensary, and processing. I think that the opportunities are endless. And the number one question that I get asked all the time is, how do I get into the industry? Look at the skill sets that you currently have now. And we would absolutely, my dad is a transportation logistics manager, and I told him, I was like, hey, why don't you think about starting a cannabis business? Cannabis is just like any other industry. Everything that exists in the grocery store industry, the medical community exists within cannabis. And these are all opportunities for equity. It's not just about dispensary, cultivation, and processing licenses.
And if I can just add, the district is really not that big geographically. And when you think about how many dispensaries might actually exist in the district, like the amount of dispensary owners we'll have in DC is not going to be enough to really spread well. So I think, speaking to what Courtney is raising here, we need to think about unique ways to build out jobs in the industry that are not just owning dispensaries. On the ownership side, we for sure should be intentional to make sure that ownership is diverse, inclusive of people directly impacted. But separately, we also need to think about the micro businesses and opportunities that are at the lowest threshold level in terms of the financial need to enter. That's going to be the way that we get the most vulnerable in our communities to be able to enter the industry if that's what they want to do. Not everyone wants to own a storefront, and I can't articulate that enough. I think for folks who, that's their skill set and that's kind of what they want to do, I think we should be able to make that possible and more accessible. But we really need to think about ways to build out job opportunities in the industry that are at all different levels and have lower thresholds to entry.
And our ownership opportunities, I will just say that.
So diving right into the ownership piece, we have a question from an attendee that says, I began the process to apply to be a licensed processor 2 years back. Upon reading the requirements, the only thing that hindered me continuing was the access to capital. As a resident of Maryland who's an entrepreneur in the cannabis space, what can we do to encourage our legislators aside from lobbying and writing letters? Because we've done that endlessly for years now.
John,
Councilmember
I missed the last part of that question. I'm sorry.
the last part just says, as a resident of Maryland who is an entrepreneur in the cannabis space, what can we do to encourage our legislators aside from lobbying and writing letters? Because we've done that endlessly for years now.
Encourage them to do
This is
what?
specifically in being able to gain access to capital to enter into the cannabis space.
Well, you could always, I mean, besides lobbying, you can elect some new legislators if they aren't, figuring out that this is a priority for folks. But I also recognize, and I don't want to be sort of curt, and I think it's a very good, important question. But I do understand that Maryland has made some strides as well, and I can't speak specifically to what they're doing. I've looked at some of the stuff that they've done in other jurisdictions, obviously, but I've approached, and not to sort of get off on a tangent, but I think it is critical that everything we do as a government be done through the lens of racial equity, irrespective of the industry, whether it is cannabis, recreational or medical, or it is housing or employment or criminal justice reform. We should be doing it through the lens of racial equity. Hence my work on the Racial Equity Achieved Results Act. And so I think just pointing them to some of the best practices. We haven't passed ours here yet, but there's some other jurisdictions that have, and to the extent they are things that you'd like to see in Maryland or somebody from another jurisdiction, then really encouraging your legislators to look at those things and show them the benefit of them as well. And for folks who are in this space that I'm in, showing them some of the revenue that jurisdictions are receiving as a result of their programs, I think would be helpful too.
And not to pass the buck on the council, and speaking at least on Washington, D.C., a lot of blame should be placed on Congress for blocking the ability to even have the conversation about adult use. Our market right now is limited to medical because of Congress. And the hope is that we'll be able to fix that dynamic this Congress. But, reach out to Congress members. A lot of people outside of DC are able to weigh in on this because DC is, for obvious reasons, a political playground for Congress. So it's a matter of Congress, getting their hands off DC and allowing DC to actually regulate. And then we can actually talk about what it looks like to offer people funds to be able to reduce the financial barrier to enter the industry in DC outside of the medical industry.
I agree with that. And I would just add that this is an integral part of statehood conversations. Again, we should have the autonomy to set our own regulation and sales of recreational cannabis. So I would like to see that be more part of statehood conversations too.
I appreciate you mentioning that, Doni. Any opportunity we get to drop statehood, we should do that.
I see the flag.
Absolutely.
We're getting down to the bottom of our questions. We have one question that just came in and wanted to know about how the revenue will be spent in the District of Columbia for marijuana. Is there any projection in the upcoming legislation?
Should I take that?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Doni. Go ahead, Doni.
I was just going to say, so right now, the council bill says that the 30% of the cannabis sales tax revenue is going to go to the fund that will support social equity applicants. So that's the grant, the technical assistance, the loans that we mentioned. And then 50% is going to go to CBOs, community-based organizations. And those CBOs are not decided yet, but hopefully will be informed by the community. I believe the mayor has oversight over that. So that's what's in the bill right now.
Emphasis on.
I would say the council bill spells out a few different issues, broad issues, violence prevention, housing, substance misuse treatment. So I think it spells out kind of broad issues that the money can be used for. which is different than the mayor's bill. I think the mayor's bill kind of has two grants as well, two funds as well. One which has licensing fees going towards administrative costs, and then the other fund seems to be kind of spelled out different kind of appropriation style issues. So she spells out different issues that the money will go to versus kind of a grant program that's oversaw by community members. And I would like to just offer that I think, the council's bill is a better approach. But the money at least would be 50% to community investment, 30% to social equity, and I believe 20% to general funds.
Go ahead, no, Donnie, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say really quickly, I like that the council is using percentages. The mayor is using a set amount, like $1 million in one fiscal year.
Right.
So that's way more limited.
Mm-hmm. This is a big industry. It's going to be a lot of money. So it's really amazing. It's something that should be acknowledged, that 50% of revenue is going back to communities, regardless of interest in the industry. I think that's incredible.
Something else that should be acknowledged, and I was just going to say this, is you all's involvement in this space. And I have so appreciated your efforts in other places, but also here in helping me, my staff, the chairman, and others get to the point where we made that introduction of our bill. I did want to say earlier, put an emphasis on that's what the bill says right now, because there is a legislative process that is ahead. At some point, there will be a hearing. There'll be opportunities for folks to come down and testify. And I don't mind stating that I think, at least at the onset of implementation, none of the money should go to the general fund. It should all be allocated to address some of the challenges that we've seen in the past, harms that have been created by the war on drugs and other things. And so I'll probably have some challenges ahead, and maybe some of my colleagues might disagree, but there'll be time for us to get into that. But I'll just say I've appreciated you all's efforts thus far, and look forward to the road ahead in this space. I'm gonna just turn to you all to see if you could offer us some closing remarks. We're a little bit over time, but I think it's for a good reason. I think we've had a great discussion. I appreciate everybody who's been participating. The questions were great, and we look forward to engaging you all. So I'm going to turn first to Doni, then Courtney, then Queen to close us out. Doni?
I would just thank you and your team again for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I really enjoyed this. I think we hit upon a lot of important points on why we must center racial equity, center Black and Brown people as a part of this industry. I'm really excited to see hearings be held, hopefully this summer. And I'm interested in working with you all as we get to that point to make sure that the council bill is as strong as it can be. And if anyone's interested in doing something organizationally on 420, feel free to reach out to me. I know that's coming up 2 days before the mayor's budget drops, but just let me know.
Thank you, Doni. Courtney?
Yes, thank you again, Councilmember McDuffie, for inviting our organization and me to speak. I would say that as a person, as a policy person, that it's a long journey. And I know that it's been, that we've been on it for a while, but bills are not perfect. We have to, continue to work through the full policy making process. It includes advocacy, education, support for entrepreneurs. We have to really continue to engage stakeholders. And so I always I remember this quote, not really a quote, but just when David Axelrod, I know President Obama were working on the Affordable Care Act, he said, hard things are hard. And I think that this is something that some folks may feel like it's impossible. I mean, the conversations about statehood and the rider and the adult use and social equity. And yes, these are all challenges, but with true stakeholder engagement and with the right elected officials, I truly think that we can continue to create something that is an industry that's inclusive. I think it's exciting that we even have this opportunity right now. And so we would like to embrace it and make the most of it. And thank you again for including us and looking forward to continued conversations.
Excellent. Thank you, Courtney. Queen?
Yeah, and if I can just, again, thank you for the invitation and again, for your commitment to this issue and for acknowledging how important this issue is now and even previously. I just would leave folks with the fact that we are in a really historic moment and time and drug policy and just justice reform broadly. I'm really excited to see what's in store for the district as we are on this journey. But similar to what Courtney said, like this is a very difficult battle, and you know, legislation and policy can go but so far, and there's a lot of issues that we have to grapple with in the process. And it's not going to be perfect, but that's the goal because that's what our communities deserve based on everything that we've experienced over the years. So I'm hoping that, you know, we have the opportunity to really think progressively and think boldly when it comes to what regulation and equity should look like here. Just because the harms have really been devastating. Folks who have felt that personally know that. And it's up to our representatives and our government here to really censor that truth and fight for that in policy. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity to testify before the council, and I really encourage folks to keep an eye out for that movement when it happens, because your voice definitely is going to matter here. And I'm looking forward to the conversation that we can finally have after years of the Initiative 71 passing, finally being able to actually have this fruitful conversation. So thank you again for the invitation.
And thank you, Queen, as well as Doni and Courtney for participating. I have thoroughly enjoyed this, and I greatly appreciate, again, the time you all spent this evening, but also just your work that you've done in this space. And so, you know, really, this has been the kind of discussion that I think helps to reaffirm the importance of the work around social equity in the cannabis industry, but also the work of elected officials. And it keeps me motivated to do, as you just mentioned, Queen, which is fight to help to break down the structural barriers that continue to drive, I think, the really deep and intractable racial inequities and that stark racial wealth gap that exists in the District of Columbia. With these types of efforts, we'll see those kinds of things start to dissipate. And so, again, I appreciate your efforts on this and the other work that you all are doing at your respective organizations. This is just the beginning, though. If you've been watching, and this is just the beginning of this issue. We've already got the medical marijuana program. Again, I mentioned that I'm filing an emergency to make some modifications to that this week, and it'll be on the agenda hopefully for the next council legislative meeting next week. And I hope the folks who participated will tell others, and that will spread the word far and wide about what we're doing here in the nation's capital, and that you all continue to monitor our team's efforts in this space. So again, thank you. Thank you, staff, John, Malcolm, and everybody else, Ogo, who's worked a lot on this issue, the chairman, Charles Allen, and others. We look forward to seeing where this goes. And you all have a good rest of your evenings.